I don't understand why manufacturers and car enthusiasts are obsessed with 0 to 60 times.
I don't get it.
What's that? I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense for like slow cars because it tells you roughly how long it would take to accelerate to, say, highway speed. But I don't think that's why most people are interested in it. They view it as a performance metric. But when you do a race, like a drag race, you don't race to a speed, you race across a distance. If you go to a drag strip, you'll typically race either an eighth mile or a quarter mile, or if you just happen to be a top fuel drag racer, then you would race, I think, 1,000 feet, just for safety reasons, because those cars get so ridiculously fast after a quarter mile, I think like over 300 miles an hour. But I keep seeing people talking about 0 to 60 times like they're such an important performance metric. And it especially doesn't make sense for today's performance cars that have so much power they can't even utilize it. Because what really limits how fast you can go in terms of acceleration is the friction between the tires and the road. For example, a while ago I saw this article from Car and Driver saying that the new Ferrari SF90 broke their 0 to 60 time record, beating out the Porsche 918 Spider by 0.1 second and doing the 0 to 60 in 2 seconds. And then you also have companies like Tesla putting these bogus 0 to 60 times where they include the 1 foot of rollout, which I'm not going to get into for this video. I think the channel Engineering Explained did a pretty good job of explaining why that's dumb.
Motor Trend's data shows that what I predicted previously was correct, and actually my predictions were better than what Tesla did. Tesla did worse than I thought they would.
They only do that to say that they broke the 2-second mark. And it's because this 2-second barrier is so hard to get past for car manufacturers. Nobody has made a production car that goes 0 to 60 in under 2 seconds with street tires on a regular road surface. But that's not the fault of any of the cars. That's just physics. And I would argue that 0 to 60 times are dumb because the tire technology just isn't there yet. And really, if we want to look at a performance metric for performance vehicles, we should be looking at the quarter mile time.
I live my life a quarter mile at a time.
And I'm gonna use physics to explain why.
As I mentioned before, what determines how fast a car can accelerate is the friction. So we're going to have to calculate the force of friction between the tires and the road. And to do that, we're going to need the coefficient of friction. Even for the best road-going tires on a normal road surface, the best coefficient of friction you're going to get is about 1.4. But what is the coefficient of friction? The coefficient of friction is a proportionality constant between the force of friction, which is denoted as F here, and the normal force, which is denoted as N. So as the wheels on your car turn, they apply a force to the ground, which is denoted by these blue arrows here. And according to Newton's third law, that means that there is a force equal in magnitude and opposite in direction applied from the road to the car, as shown by the green arrows here. Now what about this normal force? Well, the weight of the car is pulling the car down onto the ground, and that weight of the car is calculated by multiplying the mass of the car by the acceleration of gravity. And again, according to Newton's third law, if there is a force from the car to the ground, there must be an equal and opposite force from the ground to the car. And that is the normal force. So here we can see that the normal force is also going to be m times g, g being the acceleration of gravity, because the car is not accelerating, it's just sitting on the ground. In reality, the car has its weight distributed between the front and rear tires, but this actually doesn't matter because, as we can see here, the equation actually turns out to be the same thing. We end up getting that the normal force is mg because half of the weight is distributed between each of the front and rear axles, but so is the normal force. So what we get is that the force of friction is equal to the coefficient of friction times the mass of the car times acceleration of gravity, g. Now, according to Newton's second law, this is equal to the mass of the car times the acceleration in the direction of this force. So we're talking about the friction force, which is lateral to the ground. So this is equal to the lateral acceleration, A, times the mass of the car. And what you can see here is that the m's on each side cancel out if we divide both sides by the mass of the car. And we're left with this nice simple equation where the lateral acceleration across the ground is simply equal to the coefficient of friction times the acceleration of gravity. So if the coefficient of friction is 1.4, that means that the acceleration is equal to 1.4 times the acceleration of gravity. Well, that would mean that the car accelerates at 1.4 times the acceleration of the car in free fall. Or another way of saying it is 40% faster than a car in free fall. If we assume that the car can maintain this maximum level of acceleration determined by the friction between the tires and the road, then we can calculate how long it will take the car to go from 0 to 60 miles an hour because the acceleration would be constant. It would be whatever's determined by the friction. So if we rearrange this equation where we have t equals the other variables, we can plug in the numbers, do some unit conversions, and then we can get a time, which in this case, for a coefficient of friction of 1.4, we get 2.0 seconds. And what do you know? This is exactly what Car and Driver measured for the Ferrari SF90. So why can the Ferrari do this while other cars cannot? Well, for one, it's all-wheel drive, which is important when you're trying to get as much traction as possible. It's also a hybrid and has a very sophisticated traction control system. There's actually electric motors that help drive the car along with the internal combustion engine. And these electric motors can respond very quickly to changes in grip level when the tires begin to slip, for example. And this is really important if you're trying to maintain that maximum level of acceleration just at the edge of grip. And lastly, it has over 900 horsepower. That is a ridiculous amount of horsepower. That is over 4 times as much horsepower as my Fiesta in a car that weighs about the same.
That's ridiculous.
I know, it's amazing.
Satan is your daddy.
Why are you here, Jesse?
Amazing.
Oh yeah, that's right.
But you know what's more amazing? Is that we can actually calculate how much power is required to maintain this amount of acceleration up to 60 miles an hour. And that's because power is just the amount of work done per unit time. And work is just force over distance. So if we look at distance in the numerator and time in the denominator, we can rewrite this equation as force times velocity.
Amazing.
So power tells you how much force you can apply at what velocity. So to calculate how much power we need, we just need to plug in the force and the maximum velocity that we need to achieve, which is 60 miles an hour.
Amazing.
Here's that equation with the numbers for the Ferrari SF90 plugged in. Again, we do some unit conversions, and we find out that the required horsepower is actually 790 horsepower. Now that's a lot of horsepower, but this car actually produces 986 horsepower.
Amazing.
So, like I said at the beginning of the video, 0 to 60 times don't really make sense for these performance cars because they already have more power than they need to achieve these 0 to 60 times. It really comes down to how well the traction control system works and whether the car's transmission can shift fast enough to not produce any additional delay.
Amazing.
Now, if you study automotive engineering, or you just watch a lot of engineering explained videos,
He's hilarious.
you're probably thinking that I'm not telling the whole story. For one, I'm not including weight transfer in any of these calculations. Weight transfer is the phenomenon in which the percentage of the weight of the car changes as it accelerates or decelerates. For example, as the car accelerates, a larger percentage of the car's weight shifts to the rear axle, and the opposite happens under braking. I'm also not including load sensitivity. Load sensitivity is where the coefficient of friction changes for the tires as the load increases. This load can be not only the pressure on the tire from the weight of the car, for example, but also something called slip angle, which is where the wheel rotates slightly faster than the actual contact patch touching the road, which deforms the tire and changes the coefficient of friction.
This is complete.
Well, that's a little harsh. I mean, I wouldn't say it's complete. These factors really only reduce the coefficient of friction, so by not including them in the calculations, I'm actually creating a harder standard for the cars to meet in terms of their 0 to 60 times.
There is no weight to what you're saying.
Fine, if you want to be like that, we'll do what you do in your videos, and we'll look at the braking distance to determine how fast the car should be able to accelerate. Because the Ferrari SF90 has a roughly 50-50 weight distribution between the front and rear axles, the weight transfer is about the same for acceleration and deceleration. And because the brakes on just about any car are strong enough to lock up the wheels and skid the tires, the braking acceleration should be close to what the theoretical maximum amount of acceleration is for this car. Just a quick aside here, when I talk about calculating times and distances by assuming that the acceleration is constant, I'm assuming that we're using what's called the kinematic equations, and I'm not deriving them in this video, but I thought I should mention what they are, and I'm not deriving them because they require doing some calculus, and maybe I'll make that a video in the future. And also I just wanted to let Marley in on the action here because he was getting a little lonely. According to Car and Driver, this car can decelerate from 60 miles an hour to 0 miles an hour in 90 feet. And if we assume that the acceleration is constant at the edge of grip, then we can calculate that acceleration using this equation here. By rearranging it so all of the terms other than acceleration are on one side, we can plug in the numbers, do the unit conversions, and get an acceleration of, well, would you look at that, negative 1.4 g. Which is exactly the amount of acceleration that we were looking at whenever I did it just from the basic calculation using the coefficient of friction. The only reason there's a negative sign here is because it's decelerating rather than accelerating. Ha! Take that, Jason.
This is a douche. This is you.
No, not you, the other Jason. Is it me? My name's Jason. I'm talking about the Jason from Engineering Explained. The Jason...
You suck.
This is complete.
Douche.
Okay, look, all I'm saying is that the maximum amount of acceleration that we estimated is actually a reasonable value. That's all I'm trying to say. Keeping that in mind, let's take a look at how fast you would be able to do a quarter-mile time, and why the quarter-mile time is actually a better performance metric than the 0 to 60 time. To calculate the quarter-mile time, we have to use a different equation because we have to calculate the time to travel a distance rather than the time to travel to a certain speed. So here's the equation that we're going to use, where x is the quarter mile, the distance we want to travel, and we can plug in the other numbers, which the initial position x0 and the initial velocity v0 are going to be 0 because we start at the start line at 0 miles per hour. And then we solve for t, and we find that we get a time of 7.7 seconds.
Amazing.
Furthermore, we can calculate how fast you would be going at the end of the quarter mile using the same equation we were using before. And if we do that, we find that you would be going 235 miles per hour. Now those are some really impressive numbers. No production car gets anywhere close to that quarter mile time. The Ferrari SF90 only does the quarter mile in 9.5 seconds. 7.7 seconds is like a speed you would expect from purpose-built drag cars. And 230 miles per hour, I mean, that's faster than the top speed of most cars. The Ferrari SF90 only has a top speed of, I think, 210 miles per hour. And part of that is because we're neglecting air resistance, which is definitely not going to be negligible at these speeds. But trying to incorporate air resistance can be a little complicated because these cars also have aerodynamic features that improve grip at higher speeds, things like spoilers and splitters. So the coefficient of friction, while it doesn't change, the amount of grip will change because you're effectively increasing the normal force. Keeping that caveat about the air resistance in mind, how much power would you actually need to do this quarter-mile time with normal road tires on a normal road surface? Well, we can calculate that using the same equation we did before. And even for a fairly light car at 3,000 pounds, which is lighter than the Ferrari and lighter than most cars, you would still need 2,700 horsepower. And in fact, because we're neglecting air resistance, you would probably really need more than this, but this is just kind of a rough estimate. But still, this is an absurd amount of horsepower, and no production car gets anywhere close to this number.
That's amazing.
Okay, Jesse, I'm not trying to be mean, but I think we've heard enough from you. In fact, I think a lot of people have probably heard too much from you.
Poor daddy feelings hurt.
And that's why you get made fun of.
Wow.
Owen, I don't have time for you either.
Wow, you're so dominant.
Get your creep out of here. Anyways, the whole point I'm trying to make is that 0 to 60 times themselves aren't necessarily stupid in their own right, but trying to get faster and faster 0 to 60 times is, because we've already reached the limit of what the tires can handle. But when it comes to quarter-mile times, we haven't reached that. But we're getting close. There are some new up-and-coming all-electric hypercars that are really pushing the boundaries of power and speed. One example would be the Rimac Nevera, which has over 1,900 horsepower and can do the quarter mile in 8.6 seconds. There's also the Lotus Evija, which we don't know too much about yet as of the making of this video, but it's claimed to have 2,000 horsepower, and there is no claimed quarter mile time just yet. In fact, I spent a lot of time in this video talking about the Ferrari SF90, but just to give you an example of how fast these cars are, here's a quick clip of the Rimac Nevera completely obliterating the Ferrari in a drag race. Owen?
Wow.
Pop quiz. The calculations in this video left out two things that people often think are important. One, I left out the surface area in contact between the tire and the road. Most people intuitively think that a wider tire has more friction. And a lot of times, practically, it does. But in none of the calculations did I use the size of the tire or the area in contact with the road. So why is this? I'll leave that for you to ponder. The other thing that I didn't mention was torque. You can think of torque as a twisting force. For example, in an internal combustion engine, when the gasoline ignites, it heats up the gases in the cylinder, causing them to expand. This expansion applies a force to the piston in that cylinder and gets transmitted to the crankshaft, causing it to rotate. This causes the gears in the transmission to rotate, and then causes the wheels and the tires to rotate. So if the torque produced by the engine causes a twisting force to the wheels and the tires, which are in contact to the road, why is it not important? Isn't that what determines the force applied between the tire and the road? But all I ever talked about was power. I never actually mentioned the torque produced by the engine. I'll let you think about that, and in the future I'll probably make some videos about these two topics explaining why they weren't relevant in the calculations for this video. But really though, why does any of this matter? I mean, who needs a car that fast? My Fiesta's fast enough, right? Right, it's fast. I mean, I guess it would be really cool to have like a really fast car, like Ty Lopez. Yeah, he's got fast cars. Here I am in my garage, just got this Ford Fiesta. Okay, well I didn't just get it, but here I am in my garage with my Ford Fiesta. You can tell that it's fast because it's got racing stripes. Aerodynamics. It's a lot of fun driving past cornfields here in the Midwest. Okay.
But you know what I like a lot more than materialistic things?
Knowledge.